artists! Today we're going to be learning about watercolors. So grab your sketchbook and let's get started. To start, we're going to need to gather some materials. First, watercolor paper. This kind of paper is different from our sketchbook or printer paper because it's thicker. Paper soaks up water, and thin paper will start to warp and the paper fibers will start to come off. But watercolor paper stays flat and keeps the colors nice and even because it is thicker. We'll also need paintbrushes, water, watercolor paints of course, and a rag or paper towel. Watercolors often come with all the colors in a tray, and the little individual circles of color are called the pans. Watercolor paints are naturally water-based, which means they start dry and need a few drops of water to activate the paint. Because of this, they are also more light and transparent than other paints. Now that we're ready to start experimenting, I'm going to take a piece of watercolor paper, tape it into my sketchbook, and gather the rest of my materials. Now you might notice that sometimes your watercolor pans or the tray is a little messy with old watercolors. You can use clean water to get the dirty area a little wet, mix it up if you need to with your paintbrush, and then wipe or dab it off with a rag. Super easy cleaning. We're going to experiment with 4 different techniques. The first is called dry brush. I've already put a few drops of water in my watercolors to activate them, and I'm making sure that my brush is super dry by wiping it on my rag. Then I'm going to take the teensiest bit of paint on my dry brush and wipe it onto the paper, creating a really scratchy texture. Notice that whenever I want to change colors, I clean my paintbrush in the water and wipe it dry with a rag. The second technique is called a flat wash. A wash means to cover an entire layer with watercolor, and flat means that it's all going to be the same even color. So a flat wash means we're covering an entire area with an even layer of color. And don't forget to clean your paintbrush! The third technique is called wet on dry. We're going to take a wet paintbrush with wet paint, and we're going to paint on dry paper. This gives a different effect to our fourth technique called wet on wet. We're going to start with a water wash on our paper, 1 layer of water just to get the paper wet. Then we're going to take wet paint and paint on top of wet paper. That's where the name wet on wet comes from. This makes the colors bleed out and look almost fuzzy, really cool. Now you might have noticed that there's no white paint in a watercolor set. So how do we keep an area white when using watercolor? Let's try 3 different ways. Our first method is simple, just don't paint over an area. This takes some planning beforehand, so make sure you're mindful about where your paintbrush goes. A second method works if you're worried about getting a little messy, and we'll need an extra material, masking tape. What we're going to do is put the tape down and block out the area that we want to keep white. Then when we're ready, we'll paint over the top of all of it. The paint is still wet, so we're going to wait for it to dry before we peel off the tape, so that way everything stays clean. The last method is to use a paper towel or your rag to blot the paint. But this can only work if the paint is wet. So if your paint is dry, add a little bit of clean water with a clean paintbrush to the painting. It's not perfect, but it would help especially if you make a mistake on a painting. I'm going to make a quick note of that in my sketchbook. I'm also noticing as I use watercolors that using more water gives me lighter colors, and using less water creates darker colors. Now that the paint is dry, I'm going to take the tape off, and our masking technique worked. There's a little spot where the paint bled through, but that's okay. Let's try and use what we've learned in a practice painting. I'm planning out some of the areas that I want to keep white with masking tape before I start painting. Then I'm using the flat wash technique for the doghouse and the grass area. And I'm remembering to wash my paintbrush in between switching colors. A clean paintbrush will keep our paints clean. I thought it would be cool to try the wet on wet technique in the sky area and then a flat wash in the dog, but some of the areas with a lot of water started to bleed into each other, so I used the blotting technique with my rag to fix my mistakes. Next time I'll make sure to wait a little longer for the paint to dry. When everything was dry, I did a dry brush method over the dog and the grass areas to try and create a more of a fuzzy texture. And then finally, when everything was dry, I peeled away the masking tape and voila, all finished. Let's end on some reflections. Today I learned that blotting helps remove puddles of water and mistakes I made on my painting. I learned that keeping my water and my paintbrush clean helps me keep my watercolors clean. Finally, I learned that I should go slow and steady and practice a little bit of patience so I don't have colors accidentally bleeding into each other. Now that we're finished, don't forget to take care of your tools and clean them off, especially your paintbrushes. Thank you for watching, keep creating, and I'll see you next time.